heart welcome to yet another edition of your weekly international current affairs program, Globewatch, from the Cameroon Radio Television, with me, Charles Ebune. The growth rate of the world is expected at 2.7% this year as compared to 2.9% last year. That is a decrease, which literally translates to a more difficult 2024 economically. Just how far a government struggling to keep the books balanced in a more morose global economic environment. My guest today has plus 10 years of experience in development economy. Dr. Abrams Tagem, welcome to Globewatch.
Welcome, Charles. Thank you for having me here.
The International Monetary Fund says that the forecast for 2024 this year is 2.7% as compared to 2.9% last year. That is a decrease. Simply put, what does that mean?
In terms of the forecast, so there are very, what the IMF likes to call macroeconomic fundamentals, which contribute to growth across countries and across regions. And they do their forecasts with the World Economic Outlook. It's the flagship IMF report, which comes out twice a year, which coincides with their IMF World Bank meetings, which also hold twice a year. So the outlook, based on their forecast... April, October, yes. So based on the forecasts, we are going to experience a 0.2 percentage point drop in economic growth. That can be attributed to, the difficulties or the global headwinds which we are facing now. The pandemic or the coronavirus pandemic is receding, so most countries are picking up after that. But just when people thought they were out of, some kind of turbulence, then we had the Russia-Ukraine squabble, which is almost turning into a full-blown war. It sent prices very high, and then, oil prices went up, food prices went up, fertilizer prices went up, which contributed to inflation, which hasn't been receding as much. It's just now again being compounded by the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which again, we're talking about a region which sits on significant oil reserves. So the effects are going to be palpable on energy markets. Again, the prices are going to go up, and then there might also be, general lack of risk from, investors. They lose confidence and they don't want to diversify their portfolios. Hence, it's also contributing to the reduction in global output. For a country like Cameroon, most countries, we are going to grapple with that because we are oil producers in Cameroon, especially in the Central African sub-region where you have Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. Those are all oil or natural resource-rich countries. So all these external and external pressures, especially on the oil prices, contribute significantly to what those countries can do in terms of their output.
Let's just hang on the Middle East and especially around the Gulf area. Strategically, like you said, this is the belt of the global oil market, where you have all the giants, Qatar, be it gas, Saudi Arabia with petrol or fuel, and all the rest, Iran. How much does that create a havoc to the consumer market when you have areas like the Iranian Strait of Hormuz, which is 30% of global oil transaction or maritime trade? When such regions of the world continually remain in a jigsaw puzzling situation, how much shock waves are sent to the global economy?
The shock waves, we can analyze them in two directions. First, it's going to be political, and then it's going to be economic.
Okay.
In terms of politics, it might become some kind of proxy wars between superpowers. If you remember, the world wars, or one of the world wars, wasn't because, some two superpowers were fighting. It eventually became a proxy war. So, for example, Israel can be seen as...
talking of World War I.
Exactly, yeah. So Israel is a very strong ally of the US. We know that. So this can be seen as a proxy war between Israel and the US, and Hamas and Hezbollah, and Iran, which can actually drag Russia and China into it. So now they become two different blocs, and then it becomes, a war between superpowers. It can also contribute to economic fragmentation, because African countries, depend on these developed or advanced countries for their funding, for their investment, for their, trade finance. So it now becomes difficult for you to, you either have to pick one block or the other which has strong economic repercussions for the countries. Now, if we go in terms of the economic aspects, we are looking specifically at, the global risk appetite and the effects through the energy market. So if there is going to be it's actually going to depend on how long the fighting continues, If the fighting persists, then we can look at, oil and gas supply disruptions, which also influences the supply chains. We can look at, elevated oil prices, elevated gas prices, and all kinds of trade restrictions, and that's going to dampen the kinds of markets to which our African countries can sell their products. For example, African countries, especially in the CEMAC region, are at the bottom of the global value chain. So we are net, exporters of raw materials. The commodities which we produce or the commodities which we extract from the ground, in terms of oil, it's crude. In terms of gas, it's also at a very basic level. So we export it. Now, if we have difficulties exporting to those markets because of some geopolitical tensions, then what do we do with the natural resources? They get stranded.
As a development economist, how much of a danger of all what you are seeing is to countries that are struggling to take themselves out of the poverty line?
It's a fundamental problem because, again, we export in crude or raw materials or commodities, and we import the finished products, you get. And if import prices go high because of geopolitical tensions, if oil prices go high, it also translates into food prices and food security. Africa is one of the most food insecure regions in the world, right? Which means that the government is now going to be grappling in terms of their exports, export revenue and foreign exchange. For all these CEMAC countries, especially Cameroon, that depend hugely on the natural resources, foreign exchange from those natural resources is a fundamental part of government revenue, which means that the government is now lacking revenues to be able to invest in the kinds of spending that's going to alleviate people out of poverty. I'll take an example. If the oil prices go up, import prices go up, which means that we are now selling the oil which we have, which is very crude, and we are importing at a much higher price. The reason why my discourse focuses a lot on oil is because that region, like I said, sits on significant oil reserves, so they know what they have. And they have the leverage to be able to, move world markets in the direction they see fit, you get. In terms of the World Economic Forum, I think that's going to be, very high on their agenda, and I wouldn't be surprised because the whole Israel-Hamas thing, I think it happened sometime after the World Bank IMF meetings, right?
Sure.
Which means that it's probably going to be factored in into their outlook for April. So I don't know much about the World Economic Forum, but I could say, as far as I know about economics, that it's going to be high on the agenda in the forthcoming IMF World Bank meetings.
The coronavirus you mentioned sapped roughly $100 trillion from the global development initiatives. The Russia-Ukraine war cost the world already roughly $70 billion last year just alone. When you look at all those financial losses and you match them with the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, 6 years from now to be attained, probably we should be on the wrong track, right?
Yeah, saying on the wrong track isn't going to cover it entirely. Yeah. The goals were always lofty to begin with, and then that was 2015, which when I think about it now, it's been 9 years. So it's been a while. So believe it or not, like you said, we have 6 years to go. And we weren't even making much progress to attain the goals because whilst the advanced countries were able to move forward because of their significant fiscal space, developing countries were lagging. Hence the whole idea of leaving no one behind, which is very fundamental to what the UNDP does, right? So I would say for a fact that I don't think we'll be able to make the SDGs, because what do we need to be able to do those SDGs, to be able to invest in the SDGs? We need to raise more revenues and we need to be able to get development financing. So in terms of foreign assistance, in terms of foreign direct investment, and also in terms of loans, so sovereign debt. But then developing countries are not raising as much money in terms of revenues because of their structural constraints. In terms of investment, most of their investments have historically been targeted to the natural resource sector. And you know about the whole Dutch disease and all, such that if you target almost all your investments to the natural resource sector, there's nothing to guarantee that is going to kickstart growth as it's supposed to be. And then in terms of debt, most of these countries are now mired in, significant debt crisis, and most of them run the risk of being in debt distress. So the most fundamental aspect, which is going to stymie our efforts into, alleviating poverty and attaining the SDGs, is going to be the lack of finance. And as I've explained, we don't raise as much revenues in developing countries. In terms of investment, it's historically, been into the, mining or natural resource sector, and there's been an increased, loss of global appetite or increased risk aversion from, international investors, and a debt crisis which is almost imminent. Yeah.
The Millennium Development Goals, which were done by the late Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, basically took roughly 1 billion people out of poverty, and the current statistics for the Sustainable Development Goals indicate that about 500 million people are already out of the poverty line. When you go to a zone like East Africa, where you have worked extensively with the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, with the IMF, and what kind of progress do you see in particular, and in which sector particularly? Road infrastructure, telecommunications, energy, or human capital investment?
First, all the sectors you've mentioned have been important in, alleviating poverty and contributing to shared prosperity. But what's important to remember is that the sectors which drive growth are very country-specific, and they depend on the politics in the country.
Okay? I totally agree with you.
So in terms of East Africa, I think a lot of their growth has also been based on agribusinesses.
Let's take, for example, a country like Mozambique that you know so well.
Okay, Mozambique, their growth was driven first because they were just coming out of, some civil war. So the country had been decimated. So the frontier for growth was quite low. So the prospects for growth were high. But when they pushed the frontier as much as they could, so they invested in human capital, they invested in agriculture, they invested in energy, but they have this thing they call the mega project.
Education, training.
Exactly, example, So education was very important. But what actually pushed their growth to the frontier was their investment in mega projects. And the mega projects, they invested significantly in the natural resource sector. So it's one of the first countries that developed their liquefied natural gas program, and they still have investments on that, which are upcoming. Of course, most of the liquefied natural gas now is in Cabo Delgado, which is now going through some period of strife and conflict. But in Mozambique, what was able to push them in front, they had significant investment in human capital, which could not be ignored. But they also have they had significant investments in agriculture, like every other African country. And their road infrastructure or their infrastructure, so investment spending also increased.
The myriad of problems we just talked about, the tensions in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and some of them found in Africa with wars, is there an opportunity of an economic sector that can drive the growth? I understand that the growth this year will be driven, the upward curve will be driven by India, will be driven by a country like Niger, that is quite surprising for my audience, and will be driven possibly too by South Africa.
In this climate now, there is so much talk about climate change and, stopping to use fossil fuels and, green investment. So I think there is most countries that can afford to invest in, energy saving methods or climate smart, investment into energy, have the possibility to push forward. It's not going to be surprising about Niger. I don't know what they have, if it's iron ore, if it's bauxite, but they have one of those fundamental components that are important for some energy smart investments and energy smart evolution.
Uranium.
Yeah, but uranium is almost like what used to produce dirty bombs, I think.
Yeah, sure. I watched the president of the African Development Bank towards the end of the year last year. I was saying that Africa possesses roughly $6.3 trillion of natural resources wealth, but yet we are not getting out of poverty, and he identified governance as a a key issue. Do you share that point of view with him?
Yes.
From an economic perspective?
Yes, yes. Governance, like I mentioned, deals with the institutions of your country, and the institutions in a country are inextricably linked to the politics of a country. Nothing can move, Charles, without politics, okay? Even when we talk about the developed countries and we talk about their institutions being very strong and resilient, it's because their politics, I mean, everybody seems to be venal, so we are all susceptible to corruption. But then if you have institutions that can withstand those aspects of corruption and actually weed out what you can refer to as the bad actors, then you can build resilience. So like the president of the African Development Bank said, governance is a key challenge. And by governance, I mean politics. So it can be in terms of corruption. I wouldn't even talk about democracy because, that's very difficult to define these days. And how much can you say that democracy works in Africa? It's open to debate. There's a lot of literature on that where it's been shown that it's worked in some places, it's not worked in some contexts. I'm talking here about corruption. I'm talking here about bureaucratic capacity, about government effectiveness. Can they implement the projects they set out to implement? Do they have strong budgetary institutions? Or do most of their spending measures come as exceptional spending measures where you have treasury advances and all the like? So governance is a key challenge, and nothing can be done without the politics of the country being seen as all-encompassing. So it doesn't matter that you're from one region and then you need to boost the prospects of only everybody in your region. That's very poor politics. You need to have a whole of government approach, all of sector approach, so that you can boost shared prosperity, like is one of the buzzwords in the World Bank. So governance is key.
I said at the beginning of our conversation that you are a development economist, so you are more focused on seeing things that reduce poverty, things that see a real change in fiscal policy like physical infrastructure and all those things that make life better. Let me stay within the ambers of the African Continental Free Trade Area. When you look at the architecture of that policy, do you think it is a solid steering for the development of the continent? Because too much talk is about the commercial aspect.
Yes, you make two very good points. I think it can steer the country out, also the region, out of poverty because, we still trade a lot. We have the potential to trade in new export markets abroad, and we need to also deepen intra-African trade, which at the moment is it's in the doldrums, right? But
18%.
Yeah, which is very low.
Compared to the Asian intra-trade, which is around 60%, or North America, around 80%, or South America. Anyway, just
exactly. You might be surprised. I wouldn't pretend to know the statistics, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Cameroon might trade more with francs and China and India than they might trade with Angola, which is in Africa.
Well, that is, your imagination is quite correct.
Okay, yeah, so we don't have much intra-African trade, But the commercial aspects are important, but they will not be able to come to fruition if we don't strengthen the legislative aspects. So the laws which are going to govern how trade is done within these countries, okay? So we can talk about being able to trade with our trading partners, our neighbors, all we like, but we need to have some laws that govern that. So the laws have to be ratified. So
actually, is that the key missing line?
The missing lines are many. Countries are at different stages.
Which are the most dangerous missing lines?
First, countries are at different levels of development, and even in terms of trade, it's logical for you to trade with your neighbor, but nobody's talking about logic here. You're talking about your political interests as well. Political interests actually influence trade interests. I'll give you an example of Brexit before I come back to Cameroon or come back to Africa. The biggest trading partner they had was the EU. But there were some fissures. They had the disagreements with the EU, and then it led to Brexit. I mean, you had populists who exploited that, and then pretty much told lies to the citizens, and then they voted to leave the EU. So it's about politics. So we need to get the politics in this country right. We need to be incentivized to understand that as Africans, we need to buy in Africa, trade in Africa. I need to be incentivized as the president to be able to convince my counterparts that we need to have higher intra-African trade. So first, do we have those incentives? Each country has their own thing they're trying to do. Some countries are landlocked, which means they depend a lot on what can be done in other countries and their ports. But some other countries, for example, depend almost entirely on a particular resource. And they have a market for that resource already. How do you now convince them to try to diversify when the resource is what's bringing them all their revenues? They cannot see beyond the revenues they get from the particular resource. They're not inclined to diversify. You get?
Is it an agenda for the big countries on the continent, Nigeria, South Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Angola, and all the rest to dominate what they may call the small states, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Chad?
Well, that's taking me into a realm of politics I'm not very familiar with.
I mean from an economic
point of view. Yeah, it's still a bit political, right? I wouldn't know if that's what they set out to do. I don't know if they intend to dominate, but if you're a big country, you should be able to use your leverage.
Perception is quite important in economics, and they can lead to speculation that can either make things work or go in any of the directions.
Yeah, I don't think my speculation is going to be that influential.
No, I'm not talking about your speculation. Yeah. I'm talking about perception and speculation in economics. These are all economic dynamics.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay, so I can tell you what I know.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
If you're a big country, like a big economy and all that,
Nigeria,
you have leverage. Exactly. So you use your leverage, right?
Yeah.
I think Nigeria, they have quite much leverage now with the African Development Bank, as you'd see, So if you have, the means, you use your leverage. Now, the bigger economies in the African free, continental trade area, it's not going to be, surprising to assume that they want to exert their leverage over the smaller countries, because they have the leverage. And again, because it's also fair to assume if they are contributing significantly more to the trade in Africa than, say, example, Sao Tome and Principe, then you would expect them to have more of a voice in what's, being determined than Sao Tome and Principe, you get, which is standard.
Development economists like you, what do you tell them in such a newfound market environment?
First, how did francs get to that point? It took some time, so I would encourage them to also take time, but I would encourage them as well to think longer term.
It is a construction. It is a process.
It's a process.
Like
what happens to kill us a lot in African countries, because we are fundamentally poor and we are grappling with liquidity and financial issues, most of our goals are very short term. And I'm not talking short term like 3 years, I'm talking it's almost like you live on a day-to-day basis. In terms of a country, that's year by year. And which means that there's no agenda for long-term planning. It's always about what can we do next year, how can we generate revenues to implement these spending policies, and we keep doing that on a very short-term basis, which is unsustainable. So first you tell them, think long-term. And in terms of thinking long-term, how do we now process our raw materials? One of the biggest problems we have as Africans is that we are at the bottom of the global value chain. We just extract what we have and then we export. And then we import the finished product, which, is at a higher price. So we are net importers of the resources we are, excavating from the ground, which in my opinion makes no sense. So first you need to think long-term. And the long-term thing I'm saying, you can chug in all these things into it. If you're thinking long-term, you think about how you can invest in processing the raw materials you have in these countries and then export them now to those countries that need them. There's no reason why, for example, Ivory Coast, they have, cocoa. It's cocoa which you use to produce chocolate.
Yeah.
But you've got people who work in Ivory Coast who don't even know the taste of chocolate, I mean, it feels like a movie, right? But it's real. There have been documentaries about that. Why would you have cocoa in your country and you don't know the taste of chocolate? Because they take all of the cocoa and they export. And then they import, the nice Belgian chocolates people like to talk about.
Okay.
Some of them are, chocolate au lait, and then they are white, and then they are brownish. And then they import them into the country and they put them in all these nice environments, and we buy them very expensive. But we have the cocoa in our backyards, you get it.
The latest data indicates that roughly 13 million of them are available for the job market each year, with a very limited fiscal space. This is a new economic environment we are in for the African Continental Free Trade Area. and everybody says that it is largely to be managed by the young people on the continent who constitute at least 70% of the African population. If you had to sit with their leaders and to talk to them to drive the AFCFTA to work properly, in 3 points, what do you suggest as policy orientations?
Okay, first, this is not a point, this is just a remark. We always have to stand on the shoulders of those who were there before us. They would have to acknowledge what has been done so far and see how they can push it forward. Again, because young people tend to speak the same language, if you know what I mean, we are more of a, I wouldn't call myself part of the social media generation, but we are tech savvy, you get, and we are able to integrate into various societies wherever we go, which means that we have more in common than our fathers and forefathers did. We should be able to exploit that. We have the leverage. Now we can talk to our friends in the Gambia, we can talk to our friends in Benin. We're all young people who are either disenfranchised by what has been happening or who see the prospects of what can be done.
Seize the opportunity of technology.
Yes, I was going to get to that.
Okay.
Yes, but technology is key. You cannot move without that, okay? They also need to be able to understand that the geopolitical landscape is changing. It's becoming increasingly fragmented, and each country is aligning its interests with a certain bloc, which may not be the bloc with which their neighbors have aligned, you get. A second thing which they would have to do, they would have to build consensus amongst themselves. And remember that it's for the common good. It's about building morale towards that. It's almost like saying in developed countries, we have what we call tax morale, where you pay your taxes for my kids to be able to benefit. You don't know my kids, but you pay taxes because you want to boost shared prosperity. So we need to be able, or the youths need to be able to have that morale, you get? Because if it's about your unique interests, we're never going to move forward because the world is becoming increasingly fragmented. Even within countries that had some strong social cohesion, we're starting to see those cracks, along different lines, ethnic lines, religious lines, and all that. And finally, you mentioned that most of the interest on the African Free Continental Trade Area has been on commercial interests. Now they need to be able to pivot. Commercial interests are good. At the end of the day, we're interested in what's bringing in the revenues. But even in that, we need to look at the legislative aspects. So I'll encourage them to focus on that. How can you do this thing? How do you ratify these laws such that even in the next 50 years, our children's children can benefit from that? It's a very long-term thing. It's not about what's happening now. We want to raise money now. We want to trade now. We need the laws which have to be ratified in a way that even in the next 30 years, it becomes a vessel of itself.
Sustainable legal processes.
Legal processes, legal is judicial, right?
Judicial.
Yeah, the same thing.
Okay.
Same thing. Yeah.
Okay, and with that, we conclude the interview. Dr. Abrams, thank you very much indeed for being guest on Globewatch.
Thank you for having me here, Charles. And
You're welcome.
Thank you all for your service there.
You're welcome.